War. It has been mankind's faithful companion throughout all of history, because wherever people are, it always follows. There is no escape from it. People will always find reasons to despise each other. And when they do, violence inevitably ensues. It is not war on its own that threatens all of us, however. It is when those wars reach a grand scale that they begin to truly affect everyone across the planet. These kinds of wars are aptly labeled World Wars. Since even before the start of the 20th century, every nation across Europe had begun silently building up their military might and were slowly preparing themselves for the conflict they all knew was bound to occur. However, it was not until June 28, 1914 that the spark was ignited. On this day, Archduke of Austria-Hungary Franz Ferdinand along with his wife Sophie were assassinated when they found themselves cornered in an alley by a Serbian-born assassin. News of this assassination quickly made its way to the Austro-Hungarian government, which wasted no time in blaming Serbia for the death. So after failing to meet a list of impossible demands by the Austro-Hungarians, Serbia was at war. However, it didn't stop there. Soon Germany had joined the side of Austria-Hungary, and Russia had joined with Serbia as well. Germany, at this point, also decided to declare war on France, which inevitably pulled Great Britain into the fight. This had swiftly become a conflict on the largest scale ever known to man, but it didn't take long before both sides, the Central Powers and the Allies, had reached an almost complete standstill with trench systems running across the entire width of Europe. For most of the war, it even appeared as if the Germans were going to win. Thankfully, however, the military might of Germany began to falter, and once the Americans showed up, they had almost completely exhausted their resources. And on November 11, 1918, the Central Powers capitulated and fell to the Allies. Finally, 4 years after it had begun, the Great War was finished. But the people of the world had no idea what they had just inadvertently set into motion. Adolf Hitler, known to be one of, if not the most despicable human beings to ever be born onto the planet Earth. He had not only been around to witness the demise of his beloved Germany, but he had also fought right alongside his countrymen in the trenches. But after being sent home for injuries in the field, he had to watch silently as the place he loved so much was made into a shadow of its former self. And when the Great Depression hit on October 24, 1929, otherwise known as Black Thursday, Germany almost entirely collapsed. It wasn't until he managed to secure emergency powers, however, that Germany finally started to truly turn rotten. Adolf Hitler quickly ensured that he would not be overthrown from his new seat as dictator and began to make his plans for how he could take over the world and ensure what he called Lebensraum. Quickly, he threw the world into chaos by remilitarizing the Rhineland, taking over Austria, taking back the Sudetenland, invading the rest of Czechoslovakia, invading Poland, and finally knocking France out of the war altogether, with the Allies making their famous last stand at Dunkirk. The situation was starting to look grim for those Allied nations that remained. Not only had Germany just single-handedly taken most of Europe, but over in Asia, Japan had taken countless islands and a large chunk of a then broken China. And while most people already know more than they would have ever liked to about the atrocities committed by Germany in the duration of the war, most people are not as aware of those committed by Japan. The Japanese conducted numerous experiments on the Chinese people, who they thought to be inferior to themselves. One such experiment was when Unit 731 of the Japanese military tested so-called plague bombs on entire cities just to see if they could start a plague among the people. They could. Japanese soldiers were also responsible for plenty of horrific actions, most famously in the literal rape of Nanking, where between 40,000 and 200,000 Chinese civilians were brutally murdered. So, with Germany in control of the European front and Japan in control of the Asian front, the future was beginning to look very dark for the rest of the world. However, on December 7, 1941, Japan launched its bombing strike on Pearl Harbor, which finally pulled the United States into the war. This was when the war had reached its peak. The Americans fought hard both in the Pacific and over in Europe, where they pushed the Axis out of Africa and eventually out of Italy. Finally, on May 7, 1945, the National Socialist Party of Germany fell, with America and Great Britain coming in from the Western Front and the Russians crashing in from the East. The war was nearly over. Except for the front that continued to rage on in the Pacific against the Japanese. However, the Americans had a plan for how they were going to finish it. Instead of risking hundreds of thousands of American lives by going for a land invasion of Japan itself, they were going to use a brand new device they had just created. This device was the atomic bomb. This bomb was capable of wiping an entire city off of the face of the earth within a matter of seconds. And after dropping the oddly named Little Boy on Hiroshima and the Fat Man on Nagasaki, the Japanese finally surrendered. This marked the end of the most costly war in all of human history, which left over 70 million people dead. This brings us to modern day, a world that pretends it has peace all figured out and that casts a blind eye to the warning signs of the next impending world conflict. But what are these warning signs, you might ask? The most worrying one so far is the threat that Russia poses to Ukraine. They have already tried multiple times within the past decade to take back parts of the country, while at the same time doing things like attacking ships that try to sail through trade routes. And if Russia were to continue these actions against Ukraine, and possibly start to show threatening behavior towards other ex-Soviet states, then there could be enormous ramifications. Because if Russia decided to go after another nation in Europe that also happened to be a part of NATO, then all of the member nations would be obligated to aid them and essentially declare war on Russia. This would include the United States as well, as they are the founding member of the organization. It doesn't help either that Russia has supposedly already done drills with their troops practicing how they would invade Europe if they ever had to, or wanted to. Also, in all likelihood, if Russia ever ended up in a war against NATO, China would probably not hesitate to come to their aid. Speaking of China, yet another warning sign comes from the place that they are, at this moment, attempting to suppress and gain full control over. This is, of course, Hong Kong. Here, protesters line the streets donning gas masks in order to protect themselves from the lethal expired tear gas being used by the police. But these are no normal protests, as those who dare stand against the totalitarian government of China are essentially fighting in what appears to be the beginnings of a full-scale revolution. They have to risk being killed every day they venture into the streets just so that they can fight for their freedom. And now, the United States, along with many other nations, have declared that they will stand with Hong Kong and the people that are fighting for liberty. Of course, this could very well end in the voices of Hong Kong successfully being suppressed, while the rest of the world does absolutely nothing to stop it. But it could also be the spark that sets mankind down the path for destruction. Because if the rest of the world does decide to fight for liberty of all people, then there's a great chance that the next war would not bode well for the human race. At some point, in any future world war, some country will inevitably make a choice to use the very same weapon that swiftly ended World War II, nuclear bombs. And if these bombs are used as irresponsibly as humans have shown to be, then there will be no one left to fight the next war.